Case 1. Benjamin and Erica Sifrit. Memorial Day weekend, 2002. A bus ran its regular route through Ocean City, Maryland, filled with vacationers bound for Secrets, one of the most popular nightclubs on the Atlantic coast. Among the passengers were Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, an engaged couple from Fairfax, Virginia, who had come to the shore for a short holiday. Also on the bus were a young married couple from Altoona, Pennsylvania, who were short on fare. Ford and Crutchley helped them out. The two couples struck up a conversation, shared drinks at Secrets for several hours, and at closing time, the older couple accepted an invitation back to the younger couple's rented condominium. By morning, Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were dead, and before the week was out, their dismembered remains had been scattered across a Delaware landfill. The killers were Benjamin and Erica Sifrit, and their crime would stand for more than 2 decades as one of the most notorious thrill murders in Maryland history. Benjamin Adam Sifrit was born on October 21st, 1977 in Esterville, Iowa, and raised in a middle-class household before enlisting in the United States Navy. He completed the rigorous Bud/S training and became a Navy SEAL, but was discharged for disciplinary reasons before the killings. Erica Grace was born on February 3rd, 1978, in Roaring Spring, Pennsylvania, into a wealthy family. She attended Mary Washington College in Virginia and lived on a trust fund. The two met, married in 2001, and settled in Altoona. Their records were clean. Neighbors knew them as an attractive and affluent young couple. Beneath the surface lay something different. Investigators would later describe Benjamin as narcissistic and Erica as a compulsive hoarder with a fascination for violence. By the spring of 2002, the couple had begun a pattern of breaking into Ocean City businesses at night for sport. They were heading home from one such attempt when they met Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. Joshua Ford was 32 years old, a mortgage broker, and engaged to be married. Martha Jean Crutchley was 51, an insurance executive, known to friends as Jeannie. The two had been together for several years and had planned the Ocean City trip as a holiday weekend away from their professional lives in Northern Virginia. Family and coworkers remembered them as generous, social, and quick to help strangers. That last quality is the one that cost them their lives. When they stepped off the bus and offered bus fare to the young couple, they believed they were being kind to fellow tourists. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on May 25th, 2002, inside the penthouse suite at the Rainbow Condominiums on the north end of Ocean City, Erica Sifrit announced that her purse had been stolen and accused Ford and Crutchley of taking it. Benjamin produced a gun. Ford and Crutchley were forced into the bathroom. Benjamin fired shots through the bathroom door. Ford was killed by gunfire. Crutchley was killed by a combination of asphyxiation and stabbing. The Sifrits then dismembered the bodies in the bathtub, bagged the remains, and drove across the state line to dispose of the parts at a Delaware landfill. Erica kept souvenirs. Inside her purse, investigators would later recover the victims' driver's licenses, Martha Crutchley's wedding ring, and the spent shell casings from the shotgun. For 6 days, Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were simply missing. Their families in Virginia had reported them, but there was no body, no crime scene, no suspect. On May 31st, 2002, that changed. Ocean City Police responded to a burglary in progress at the Hooters restaurant in West Ocean City. Inside, they found Benjamin and Erica Sifrit. A search of Erica's belongings produced the victim's identification, Crutchley's wedding ring, and the shell casings. A search of the Rainbow Condominium produced blood, bullet holes, and unmistakable evidence of dismemberment. Detective Scott Bernal led the investigation. Both Sifrits were charged with first-degree murder, assault, and accessory after the fact. Prosecutors tried the couple separately, moving each trial out of Worcester County because of the intense local media coverage. Benjamin's trial was held in Montgomery County in 2003 before Judge G. Edward Dwyer, Jr. Prosecutor Joel Todd presented the physical evidence and the forensic analysis of the condominium scene. The jury deliberated for 14 hours and returned a split verdict: guilty of second-degree murder in Crutchley's death, acquitted of all charges in Ford's death. Erica's trial was held in Frederick County. She was convicted of first-degree murder in Ford's death and second-degree murder in Crutchley's death. Sentencing for Benjamin came in July 2003 before Judge Paul Weinstein, who had come out of retirement for the hearing. Weinstein imposed 38 years and delivered a statement from the bench that would define the case. He told Benjamin that masterful lawyering had spared him a life sentence and that the crime was nothing more than a thrill killing. "You are a butcher," the judge said. "You cut these people up for no good reason." Erica was sentenced to life in prison plus 20 years. The Sifrits divorced behind bars. Both filed appeals. All were denied. In March 2025, Benjamin petitioned for a reduced sentence under Maryland's newly enacted Second Look Act, with a hearing scheduled for August 2026. Erica appeared at her first parole hearing in April 2026 and was denied, with a rehearing set for April 2033. At that hearing, Joshua Ford's sister, Melissa, described 24 years of debilitating grief. Benjamin Sifrit is 46 years old, incarcerated at Roxbury Correctional Institution in Hagerstown. Erica Sifrit is 46 years old, incarcerated at the Maryland Correctional Institution for Women in Jessup. The Rainbow condominiums still stand. The bus stop where two kind strangers offered a young couple bus fare is still there. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley never came home. Case 2. Kelly and Jason Cochran. The pact was sealed before either of them had cheated. Kelly and Jason Cochran agreed, as a kind of dark vow, that if one of them was ever unfaithful, they would together kill the person with whom the affair had occurred. It was not a metaphor. It was not a drunk joke. It was a plan. And in October 2014, in the small town of Iron River, Michigan, they carried it out. The victim was Christopher Regan, a retired Air Force veteran and mining chief who had fallen for Kelly Cochran's romantic messages. He had no idea the man he sometimes saw in passing at Kelly's house had been waiting with a gun. Before the investigation was over, 2 bodies would be tied to the Cochran household. Because the pact had a second clause neither of them had written down, and Kelly would eventually turn it on Jason himself. Kelly Cochran was born on April 5, 1982, in Indiana, and raised in a working-class household. Jason Cochran was born in 1977, also in Indiana. Both had high school educations and factory town backgrounds. They married without children and eventually relocated to Iron River, Michigan, a rural community on the Upper Peninsula. Kelly worked in manufacturing. Jason held a maintenance job. Background checks on both would later turn up nothing of concern. Investigators who spent dozens of hours interviewing Kelly described her as one of the most attached and manipulative subjects they had encountered, a woman with the composure of a psychopath. Jason was described differently, as dependent and compliant, a man who had been drawn into his wife's orbit and could not find his way out. Christopher Regan was 53 years old, a divorced father, chief at an iron mining facility near Iron River, and an Air Force veteran planning a move to North Carolina to be closer to his family. He had begun an affair with Kelly Cochran in the summer of 2014. Colleagues and friends remembered him as respected, generous, and warm. He took Kelly's romantic messages at face value. He did not know that every word she sent him had been read by her husband. On the evening of October 14th, 2014, Kelly invited Chris to the Cochran home under the pretense of a private meeting. Jason hid in another room with a firearm. When Chris arrived, Jason shot him in the head. The couple then carried the body to the basement and used a reciprocating saw to dismember it. Body parts were distributed across the woods outside town. The basement was bleached. Kelly told anyone who asked that Chris had simply left town to begin his move to North Carolina. Months later, Kelly would admit a detail so disturbing it defined the case in the public memory. She claimed to have served portions of Chris Regan's remains at a neighborhood barbecue. Chris Regan did not show up for work on October 15th. He did not show up on October 16th either. After 10 days, his co-workers requested a welfare check. His abandoned car was found in town. Iron River Police Chief Laura Frizzo opened an investigation and quickly identified Kelly Cochran as the last person to have seen him. The Cochrans abruptly fled Michigan and moved back to Indiana. Frizzo continued the case. Kelly gave more than 70 hours of voluntary interviews, most of them contradictory, many of them bizarre. In February 2016, Jason Cochran died in Indiana of an apparent drug overdose. Kelly would eventually confess that she had poisoned him because she was angry he had made her kill Chris Regan. DNA found deep in the grain of the basement floorboards at the Iron River house confirmed that Chris Regan had been killed there. Kelly was arrested in April 2016 in Kentucky. Her trial began in February 2017 in Iron County, Michigan, before Judge Richard Colello. Prosecutor Melissa Powell introduced the DNA evidence, Kelly's own recorded interviews, and testimony from Chief Frizzo. The defense argued battered wife syndrome, claiming Jason had forced Kelly into the killing. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder and mutilation of a human body. A second prosecution in Indiana followed for the murder of Jason Cochran. Sentencing was in May 2017. Judge Colello imposed life without parole for the murder of Christopher Regan. An additional 65 years was later added for Jason's death. Colello told Kelly from the bench that she was a cold and calculating person. She showed no emotion. Chris Regan's friends and former colleagues remembered a man who had served his country, worked hard, and made the single mistake of loving the wrong woman. At Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, a 42-year-old woman named Kelly Cochran serves a life sentence with no possibility of parole. Her husband, Jason, is buried in Indiana. Chris Regan's remains, what portions were recovered from the Michigan woods, were returned to his family. The pact the Cochrans made in their early years of marriage had only ever needed one enforcer, and she outlived everyone it was meant to bind. Case 3. Craig Titus and Kelly Ryan. A truck driver on Interstate 15 outside Las Vegas saw the flames first. He called in the fire just before dawn on December 14th, 2005. When the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived, they found a 2005 Jaguar XJ8 burning on the shoulder of the highway. Inside the trunk was the charred body of a young woman. The car was registered to Kelly Ryan, a champion IFBB fitness professional. Her husband, Craig Titus, was a former IFBB pro bodybuilder. Melissa James, the couple's 28-year-old live-in personal assistant, was the woman in the trunk. Over the 9 days that followed, the fitness empire Titus and Ryan had spent a decade building would be reduced to mugshots on the evening news. Craig Titus was born on January 14th, 1965, in Michigan. He became a competitive bodybuilder in his 20s and earned his IFBB Pro card, appearing in fitness magazines and supplement advertisements throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. A conviction for steroid distribution had slowed his career. Kelly Ryan was born on July 10, 1972, in Minnesota. She was a former Ms. Olympia fitness runner-up, a national figure in the fitness industry, and married Titus in the early 2000s. The couple lived in a lavish home in Las Vegas. By 2005, both were using heavy doses of anabolic steroids and methamphetamine. Their finances were collapsing. Their marriage was reportedly volatile. The public image of two elite athletes at the peak of physical discipline masked a private reality of paranoia, addiction, and abuse. Melissa James was 28 years old, a dance instructor from Tennessee, who had moved to Las Vegas specifically to work as the couple's personal assistant. She was close to her mother, Maura, and had built her life around helping Titus and Ryan manage their schedules, their home, and their finances. Friends knew Melissa as sweet and trusting, a young woman who had believed she had found a stable position with a glamorous couple. She was financially dependent on them. That dependence made it difficult for her to leave, even as conditions in the household deteriorated. On December 13, 2005, a dispute inside the couple's Las Vegas home escalated into violence. Titus and Ryan believed Melissa had been embezzling money from them. Prosecutors would later dispute whether any such theft had occurred. Melissa was incapacitated with a taser, then injected with a lethal dose of morphine, then strangled. Her body was placed in the trunk of Kelly Ryan's Jaguar. Titus drove the car into the desert outside Las Vegas. He had stopped at a Walmart earlier that evening and purchased lighter fluid. He poured it into the car and ignited it. He and Ryan then fled Nevada, driving across the country toward Massachusetts. The investigation moved quickly. Taser probes recovered from Melissa's body matched a specific manufacturer. The Jaguar was registered to Kelly Ryan. Surveillance footage from the Walmart captured Craig Titus purchasing the lighter fluid. While on the run, Ryan gave interviews to fitness magazines, claiming that Melissa had stolen from them and vanished. The interviews were published while Melissa's body lay in the Clark County Coroner's Office. On December 23, 2005, Titus and Ryan were apprehended in Stoughton, Massachusetts. They were returned to Nevada and charged with murder, kidnapping, and arson. Prosecutor Robert Daskus built a case so overwhelming that both defendants agreed to plea deals before trial. In Clark County District Court, before Judge Jackie Glass, both pleaded guilty in 2008. Titus received 21 to 55 years in prison. Ryan received 6 to 26 years. At sentencing, Maura James delivered a statement describing the daughter she had lost. Titus offered an apology. Ryan wept. Judge Glass condemned the drug-fueled lifestyle that had produced the killing. Kelly Ryan was paroled in 2017 and has lived quietly since her release. Craig Titus remains incarcerated at Lovelock Correctional Center in Nevada and became eligible for parole consideration in 2026. Craig Titus is 59 years old. Kelly Ryan is 51. The fitness empire they built on images of physical perfection ended in a burning Jaguar on a Nevada highway, with a young woman in the trunk who had done nothing wrong but trust them. Case 4, Miranda and Elytte Barbour. The Craigslist advertisement was the bait. Miranda Barbour, 19 years old and 3 weeks married, had placed a companion ad online in the fall of 2013. On November 11th of that year, a 42-year-old civil engineer named Troy LaFerrara responded. Miranda arranged to meet him at the Susquehanna Valley Mall in Pennsylvania. She drove her Honda CR-V. LaFerrara did not know that Miranda's husband Elytte was hidden in the back seat with a cord and a knife. Troy LaFerrara would be dead before morning. A generation of true crime watchers would learn a new name for what the couple had done: the Craigslist killers. Miranda Barbour was born Miranda Dean on July 17, 1994, in Alaska. Her upbringing was broken and unstable. She dropped out of school, drifted through several states, and engaged in escort work. Elytte Barbour was born in 1991 in North Carolina and worked retail jobs. The two had met through an online dating platform, married in a hasty ceremony in North Carolina in October 2013, and moved to Selinsgrove, Pennsylvania, where they lived in poverty. Before 2013, neither had come to the attention of law enforcement in any meaningful way. Psychiatric evaluations after their arrests described Miranda as sociopathic and Elytte as compliant, drawn into her violent fantasies. They had been married 3 weeks when they decided to kill together. Troy LaFerrara was 42 years old, a civil engineer, married and working in Pennsylvania. He was by every account a respected professional man. The single decision that led to his death was answering an advertisement online. The meeting was set for the evening of November 11th, 2013. Miranda met Troy at the Susquehanna Valley Mall and invited him into her vehicle. They drove into Sunbury, Pennsylvania. At a designated moment, Miranda gave Elytte a signal. Elytte rose from beneath a blanket in the back seat, wrapped a cord around Troy's neck, and held it tight. Miranda stabbed him 20 times with a knife she had purchased specifically for the killing. Troy's body was dumped in an alley in Sunbury. The Barbours then went to dinner to celebrate. Miranda's later explanation to police was simple. We just wanted to murder someone together. The crime had no robbery motive, no grudge, no financial purpose. It was, in her own words, a consummation of marriage. Troy's body was discovered on November 12th by a passerby. Sunbury police traced his final cell phone call to a number registered to Miranda Barbour. Blood evidence was recovered from the interior of her Honda CR-V. On December 3rd, 2013, Miranda and Elytte were arrested at their apartment. Both were charged with first-degree murder. The death penalty was initially on the table. In September 2014, both pleaded guilty in Northumberland County Court of Common Pleas before Judge Charles Saylor. Prosecutor Tony Matulewicz accepted the plea in exchange for the couple avoiding capital sentences. Miranda entered the courtroom smirking. Before her sentencing, she gave an extraordinary interview to a local newspaper in which she claimed to have killed at least 22 other people in satanic rituals across the country. The FBI investigated her claims and debunked them entirely. The story had been fabricated, investigators concluded. For attention, Judge Saylor sentenced both Miranda and Elytte Barbour to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Troy LaFerrara's widow described in her impact statement a life shattered by the decision of two strangers to kill her husband for sport. The case contributed to the decision by Craigslist in 2018 to eliminate its personal advertisements entirely. Miranda Barbour is imprisoned at SCY Muncie in Pennsylvania at age 29. Elytte Barbour, 32, is held at SCY Forest. Neither will ever be eligible for release. Troy LaFerrara answered an advertisement. 3 weeks into their marriage, two strangers decided his life would end their honeymoon. Case 5. Tiffany Cole and Michael Jackson. The grave was already dug. For 2 days before the kidnapping, Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend Michael Jackson, and 2 accomplices had driven from Jacksonville, Florida, to a remote stretch of woods in Charlton County, Georgia, and taken turns with a shovel. The pit they prepared was shallow, roughly 4 feet deep, hidden among pine trees. On July 8, 2005, they drove a 61-year-old retired couple from Jacksonville to that grave and buried them alive. The crime would stand as one of the most brutal in Florida history, and the sentence that followed would keep Tiffany Cole on death row for 16 years. Tiffany Ann Cole was born on December 3, 1981, in South Carolina. She was 23 years old at the time of the crime. She had a high school education, no stable employment, and no significant prior record. Her boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, also 23, was a drifter with a history of petty theft. The two had moved between South Carolina and Florida throughout 2005. Cole had known the victims, Reggie and Carol Sumner, since childhood. The Sumners had been longtime friends of her family in South Carolina and had moved to Jacksonville in March of that year. They had sold Cole a car and allowed her to make monthly payments. She visited them regularly. James Reggie Sumner was 61 years old. Carol Sumner was also 61. Both were retired, living modestly in Jacksonville and in frail health. Reggie walked with difficulty. Carol had chronic medical conditions. Family and neighbors spoke of them as generous and trusting. They had helped members of the Cole family financially in the past. When Tiffany Cole came to their door on July 8, 2005, asking to use the telephone, they let her in. Once inside, Cole signaled her 3 accomplices. Jackson and Alan Wade pushed into the home. Bruce Nixon waited in the car. Reggie and Carol Sumner were bound with duct tape, forced into the trunk of the Sumners' own vehicle, and driven across the Florida state line into Georgia. At ATMs along the way, they were forced to reveal their bank PIN numbers. The total the killers obtained was roughly $61,000. Once in Charlton County, the Sumners were marched to the pre-dug grave. They were pushed in. Witnesses later said they held each other as the dirt was thrown on them. Autopsies conducted after the bodies were recovered revealed dirt deep in their lungs. They had been conscious when buried. The Sumners' adult daughter reported them missing on July 11, 2005. Their bank cards had been used at ATMs in Florida and Georgia, and surveillance footage captured Jackson making withdrawals. Within days, all 4 suspects were identified. Bruce Nixon, the youngest accomplice, was arrested first and led investigators to the grave. Cole was arrested at a hotel in South Carolina. Among her belongings were photographs of Cole and Jackson riding in a rented limousine with the Sumners' cash, smiling for the camera. The trial began in October 2007 in Duval County, Florida, before Judge Michael Weatherby. Prosecutor Jay Plotkin presented the forensic evidence, the limousine photographs, and Bruce Nixon's cooperating testimony. The defense offered no credible alternative account. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Tiffany Cole was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 2 counts of robbery. The jury recommended death by a non-unanimous vote of 9-3. Cole was sentenced to death in 2007. She spent the next 16 years on Florida's death row. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court decision in Hurst versus Florida invalidated non-unanimous death sentences. Cole's case was remanded for resentencing. The proceedings began in August 2023. On August 23, 2023, a new jury deliberated for 3 hours and voted 10-2 to spare her life. She was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Jackson was resentenced to death in May 2023 by a jury vote of 8-4. Alan Wade was resentenced to life without parole in June 2022. Bruce Nixon received 45 years through cooperation. Tiffany Cole is 44 years old, incarcerated at Lowell Correctional Institution, Annex in Florida. Michael Jackson remains on Florida's death row. The limousine photograph, showing 2 killers smiling beside stolen cash hours after burying 2 frail retirees alive, remains the defining image of the case. The grave in the Charlton County woods was filled in long ago. The Sumners rest in a Jacksonville cemetery now. Case 6. Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood. At Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, Michigan, 2 nurses' aides selected their victims by initials. The plan was to spell the word murder with the first letter of each patient's name. The two women, Gwendolyn Graham and Kathy Wood, would later explain that the killings were meant to bind their love together forever, to create something permanent between them. Graham smothered the victims with washcloths while Wood stood watch. They killed 5 elderly women in 1987. They had planned to kill more. The spelling scheme ultimately collapsed because Graham could not always find patients with the needed initials, but by the time the spelling game was abandoned, 5 women were dead. Gwendolyn Graham was born in 1963 in California and raised in an abusive household. She earned a nurse's aide certification and moved to Michigan in the mid-1980s. Kathy Wood was born in 1962 in Michigan, divorced in her early 20s, and earned the same certification. The two met as co-workers at Alpine Manor, began a romantic relationship, and worked the night shift together in the dementia ward. No charges had ever been brought against either woman before Alpine Manor. Co-workers remembered them as inseparable, unusual, intense. Other staff members would later testify that the two had joked openly about killing patients. No one had taken them seriously. The victims were Marguerite Chambers, Edith Cole, Myrtle Luce, Mae Mason, and Belle Burchard. All were elderly. All suffered from advanced dementia or Alzheimer's disease. All were bedridden or immobile. Marguerite Chambers, 58 years old, was placed at Alpine Manor by her family in 1985 because they believed she would be cared for there. Her daughter visited regularly and later recounted noticing dirt on her mother's face and extreme agitation when a washcloth was used to clean her. Chambers died in January 1987. The killings took place on the night shift. Graham entered the patient's room. Wood stood outside as a lookout. Graham pressed a washcloth over the patient's face until the woman stopped breathing. The death rate in the ward spiked during the period Graham and Wood worked together, but the victims were elderly, terminally ill, and not expected to live long. Causes of death were attributed to heart failure, respiratory arrest, or natural decline. Graham and Wood kept small items taken from the victims as trophies. After each killing, according to Wood's later testimony, they returned home and had sex. The crimes might never have been discovered. On October 7th, 1988, more than a year after the last killing, Kathy Wood walked into the Walker Police Department and told officers that her ex-husband, Ken, had something to report. Ken Wood explained that Kathy had confessed to him, describing the killings in detail. Detectives opened an investigation. Bodies were exhumed. Autopsies revealed petechial hemorrhaging consistent with suffocation. Graham and Wood were arrested. Prosecutors agreed to a plea deal with Wood in exchange for her testimony against Graham. Wood pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. Graham's trial began in September 1989 in Kent County, Michigan, before Judge Robert Benson. Prosecutor David Schieber built the case around Wood's testimony and the forensic evidence from the exhumations. The defense argued that Wood was the mastermind and had lied to shift blame. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Graham was convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Benson sentenced Gwendolyn Graham to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kathy Wood was sentenced to 20 to 40 years. The families of the victims were horrified by the lighter sentence. Investigators, including retired Walker Police Sergeant Roger Kaliniak, believed Wood had been the true planner and Graham merely the instrument. On January 16, 2020, Kathy Wood was paroled after serving just over 30 years. She was released from the federal prison in Tallahassee, where she had been housed separately from Graham, and moved to Fort Mill, South Carolina, to live with her sister. Her parole ended in June 2021. Victims' family members had fought her release in court and lost. At Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan, Gwendolyn Graham, 60, will die in prison. Kathy Wood, 61, lives in Fort Mill, South Carolina, under no supervision. The families of Marguerite Chambers, Edith Cole, Myrtle Luce, Mae Mason, and Belle Burkhard visit the graves of women who were meant to die peacefully in their sleep, and instead were smothered to give two nurses' aides something to share. Case 7. Michael and Susan Carson. The manifesto was found in the glove compartment of a stolen car. It called for the assassination of the President of the United States. It identified the president as a demon. It was signed by Michael Bear Carson and Susan Bear Carson, a married couple who had renamed themselves and declared themselves holy warriors sent by God to identify and eliminate witches. Between 1981 and 1983, across California, they killed 3 people they had labeled as witches. The killings were not committed for money or revenge. They were committed because Susan had received visions, and Michael obeyed her instructions. Michael Bear Carson was born James Clifford Carson in 1950 in Oklahoma and had earned a college degree before drifting into California's counterculture. Susan Bear Carson was born Susan Barnes in 1941 in California and had grown up in a wealthy family. She had begun showing signs of serious psychiatric illness in the 1970s, including paranoid delusions and a fixed belief that she had been chosen by God for a special mission. She and Michael married in the late 1970s. Together, they developed what psychiatrists would later describe as a shared psychotic disorder. By 1981, they had abandoned any conventional life and were drifting through farms, communes, and counterculture households across Northern California, arriving as soft-spoken house guests and leaving behind bodies. Karen Barnes was 23 years old, a writer and aspiring poet living in a shared apartment in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. Clark Stevens was 26 and operated a marijuana farm in Humboldt County, where the Carsons had worked briefly. John Hellier was 30 and picked the couple up while they were hitchhiking near Santa Rosa. All 3 had been generous. All 3 had let the Carsons into their lives. All 3 were labeled witches by Susan Carson and killed by Michael at her direction. The killings occurred between March 1981 and January 1983. Karen Barnes was stabbed in the San Francisco apartment she shared with the Carsons. Clark Stevens was bludgeoned to death on his farm. John Hellier was shot after he had stopped his car to let the Carsons out. Each killing was preceded, according to the couple's own later statements, by a vision or a command received by Susan. Each body was dumped in a shallow grave or in a remote field. The Carsons took the victims' cars and drove on. The arrest came not from a murder investigation, but from a routine traffic stop. In January 1983, California Highway Patrol officers pulled over a stolen vehicle near Santa Rosa. The driver was Michael Carson. Susan was in the passenger seat. Inside the car were weapons, handwritten manifestos, and personal items belonging to John Hellier, whose body had not yet been found. Within months, detectives had connected the Carsons to the earlier disappearances of Karen Barnes and Clark Stevens. The Carsons were tried separately in San Francisco and in other California counties between 1984 and 1985. They raised an insanity defense. The defense failed. Psychiatrists testified that despite their delusional beliefs, the couple understood that killing was wrong and had taken active steps to conceal their crimes. Both were convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. Susan Carson preached from the witness stand. Michael Carson joined her. Both were sentenced to 75 years to life, served consecutively. They have been repeatedly denied parole. Their most recent hearings produced denials. From prison, the couple has continued to write and issue religious manifestos. Susan has maintained that she is an emissary of God. Michael has defended her beliefs. Michael Bear Carson is 73 years old, incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. Susan Bear Carson is 81 years old, incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Karen Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Hellier were 3 people who offered the Carsons food, shelter, or a ride. None of them knew that Susan had been waiting for a vision to tell her they were witches. Case 8. Ray and Faye Copeland. Faye Copeland kept a ledger in the kitchen of the family farmhouse in Mooresville, Missouri. The pages were ordinary, filled with household accounts and receipts, written in her careful, old-fashioned handwriting. But alongside certain names, she had drawn a small letter, X. The names belonged to drifters her husband Ray Copeland had hired as farmhands. The X meant the man was dead and buried on the property. Between 1986 and 1989, the Copelands killed at least 5 men this way. At the time of their trials, Ray was 75 years old and Faye was 68. They would become the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. Ray Copeland was born in 1914 in Oklahoma and had a grade school education. He had spent decades as a small-time con man, accumulating convictions for forgery, livestock theft, and bad checks. Faye was born in 1921 in Arkansas, married Ray in 1940, and spent her adult life as a farm wife. The couple had adult children who had long since moved away. They lived in rural Livingston County, Missouri, on a small farm that did not produce enough income to sustain them. Ray had been banned by local cattle auctions for writing bad checks. He needed someone else's name on those checks. That is where the drifters came in. The victims were Paul Cowart, 20 years old, John Freeman, 27, Jimmy Harvey, 27, Wayne Warner, and Dennis Murphy. All had been recruited from homeless shelters and Salvation Army missions across the Midwest. None had close family looking for them. All were hired as farmhands. All were invited to open checking accounts in their own names. The accounts were used by Ray Copeland to purchase cattle at auction. Once the checks had cleared and the cattle had been resold, the drifter was no longer useful. What happened next happened in a particular order, repeated 5 times. Ray would drive the drifter out to a field or into one of the outbuildings on the farm. At some point, with the drifter's back turned, Ray would shoot him in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The body would be buried under the barn floor or in one of the outbuildings. The checking account would be closed. The scheme would be run again with the next drifter. Faye kept track in the ledger. She sewed a quilt from the clothing the dead men had left behind. The crimes were uncovered in October 1989, when a drifter named Jack McCormick, whom Ray had hired and begun to process through the same scheme, escaped from the farm and called police from a truck stop in Nebraska. He told them he believed Ray Copeland was going to kill him. Livingston County Sheriff's deputies obtained a search warrant. Within days, 5 bodies had been recovered from the property. The .22 rifle was found inside the Copeland home. Ray and Faye were arrested. They were tried separately in Livingston County Circuit Court in 1990 and 1991 before Judge E. Richard Weber. Prosecutor Doug Roberts built the case around the paper trail and the ledger with the X marks. Faye's defense argued battered wife syndrome, claiming Ray had controlled her for decades. Ray's defense argued that the drifters had simply left and that he had no knowledge of the bodies. Both defenses failed. Both were convicted on 5 counts of first-degree murder. Both were sentenced to death. Ray Copeland died of natural causes on Missouri's death row in 1993 at the age of 78. Faye Copeland suffered a stroke in 1999. Her sentence was commuted to life in prison. In 2002, she was paroled to a nursing home where she died the following year at the age of 82. Both are now dead. The farmhouse outside Mooresville is gone. The ledger with the X marks sits in evidence archives in Missouri. The 5 men who lie in cemeteries across the Midwest today were killed because they had no one to look for them. That absence of connection, that invisibility, was the precise quality Ray and Faye Copeland had selected for. Whoever drew the ledger's final X understood something chilling about how a person can disappear in America without anyone noticing. Case 9. James Marlowe and Cynthia Kaufman. Before they killed each woman, they made her take a bath. They handed her makeup. They waited while she applied it. Then they killed her. James Gregory Marlowe called himself the Folsom Wolf, a nickname earned during his years in California's state prisons. Cynthia Kaufman had been a devout Catholic waitress in Missouri 3 months before she met him. Between October and November 1986, across 4 states and roughly 6 weeks, the two kidnapped, robbed, and killed 4 women. In the sentencing that followed, Cynthia Kaufman made history as the first woman sent to California's death row after the state reinstated capital punishment. James Marlowe was born in 1956 in California and raised in an abusive household. He had spent most of his adult life in and out of prison for burglary, theft, and assault. He had prison tattoos, including one reading Folsom Wolf across his torso. Cynthia Kaufman was born in 1962 in Missouri, raised in a strict Catholic family, and had worked as a waitress in St. Louis. She met Marlowe in the summer of 1986 while he was out on parole. Within weeks, she had left her life in Missouri and begun traveling with him. By October, she was using methamphetamine daily. The victims were Sandra Neary, 45, Pamela Simmons, Corinna Novis, 20, and Lynnell Murray, 19. Novis was a business school student in Redlands, California. Murray was a clerk at a dry cleaner in Huntington Beach. Neary was a homemaker in Costa Mesa. Simmons was approached in a parking lot. All 4 were women selected because they were alone, because they had access to cash or vehicles, and because Marlowe and Kaufman had decided they wanted to kill. The method was consistent. Marlowe and Kaufman would approach the victim at an ATM in a parking lot, or as she closed a store for the night. The woman would be forced at gunpoint into her own vehicle. She would be driven to a remote location. In some cases, she was forced to bathe. She would be made to apply makeup. Then she would be strangled or suffocated. Marlowe would use a garrote or his bare hands. Kaufman would assist. The bodies were dumped in remote fields, orchards, or hillsides. The victims' cash and cars were taken. The investigation accelerated after surveillance footage from ATMs in several Southern California counties captured Marlowe making withdrawals using the victims' bank cards. An interstate task force was formed. In November 1986, the couple was tracked to a motel in Big Bear Lake, California. They were arrested without incident. Inside their room, detectives found personal items belonging to all 4 victims and a taped confession Kaufman had made to Marlowe, in which she described the killings in detail. The trials were held in San Bernardino County Superior Court between 1989 and 1990. Marlowe and Kaufman were tried separately. Kaufman's own tape-recorded confession was the central piece of evidence against her. The defense argued that she had been under Marlowe's psychological control. The prosecution argued that she had been an equal participant in the hunt. The jury in each trial returned guilty verdicts on first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Both were sentenced to death. Kaufman became the first woman to receive a death sentence in California since the state restored capital punishment in 1977. James Marlowe died on death row at San Quentin State Prison in 2021 of natural causes. He had never been executed. Cynthia Kaufman remains on California's death row at Central California Women's Facility, where she has been incarcerated since 1990. On California's death row at Central California Women's Facility, Cynthia Kaufman is 62 years old. Her appeals have been exhausted. Marlowe died at San Quentin 5 years ago of natural causes. She has outlived him, and she is still waiting for the outcome a judge ordered more than 3 decades ago. The bathtubs, the makeup, the ritual the two of them performed before each killing. Those details remain some of the most disturbing in the California capital case record. Case 10, Pazuzu Algarad and Amber Burch. The house on Nob Hill Drive had blacked out windows and a fence that hid the yard. An inverted cross hung by the front door. A hand-lettered sign warned visitors that evil would triumph. For 5 years, the neighbors of 2749 Nob Hill Drive in Clements, North Carolina, whispered about the man who lived there, a man who called himself Pazuzu after a Mesopotamian demon. They whispered about animal sacrifices, about rituals, about strangers who entered the property and were never seen again. On October 5th, 2014, Forsyth County Sheriff's deputies finally dug into the backyard. They unearthed the skeletal remains of 2 men. Pazuzu Algarad was born John Alexander Lawson on August 12, 1978, in San Francisco, California. He was raised in a Christian household. In 2002, he legally changed his name to honor a demonic figure from ancient Mesopotamian religion. The surname, he explained in court filings, meant Lord of the Locusts in Arabic. He filed his teeth into points. He covered his body, including his face and chin, in tattoos. He declared himself a Satanist. He operated a loose household in Clemens that attracted drifters, drug users, and outsiders who were drawn to his persona. In 2012, he was convicted as an accessory after the fact in the shooting death of a man named Joseph Chandler and placed on probation. He was still on that probation when the bodies in the backyard were discovered. Amber Nicole Burch, born in 1989, had drifted into the household in her late teens. She called herself his wife, though they never legally married. She lived at Nob Hill Drive with Algarad and Algarad's mother, Cynthia James. Joshua Frederick Wetzler was 37 years old. He was a father and had struggled with addiction, but was remembered by family as kind. Tommy Dean Welch was 36, a drifter who had moved in and out of the orbit of the Nob Hill household. Both men had been reported missing by their families in 2009. Both had simply vanished, and for 5 years, no one had known where they went. The first killing came in July 2009. Wetzler entered the Nob Hill house. Inside, Algarad shot him. An autopsy later found that he had been shot 3 times in the head and at least 4 times around the torso. The body was left to decompose inside the home for weeks. Algarad eventually telephoned Burch, who was in South Carolina at the time, and asked her to come back and help him bury Wetzler. She returned. The two dug a shallow grave in the backyard and placed the body in it. The second killing came 3 months later. Welch sat on the couch in the Nob Hill living room. Burch announced that she was going to kill him. Algarad told her that she knew where the gun was and that it was loaded. Burch retrieved a .22 caliber rifle, walked back to the living room, and shot Welch twice in the back of the head. The body was buried beside Wetzler's. Rumors about the house persisted for 5 years. Forsyth County deputies had been called to the property on multiple occasions. Neighbors had filed complaints. In October 2014, a search warrant was finally executed. Within hours, the skeletal remains of both men had been recovered. Algarad then 35, and Burch, then 24, were arrested at the home. Both were charged with murder and accessory after the fact and held without bond at the Forsyth County Detention Center. Algarad never stood trial. On October 28, 2015, he was found dead in his cell at Central Prison in Raleigh. The cause was suicide. He was 37 years old. The case against him ended. Burch proceeded alone. On March 9, 2017, she appeared in Forsyth County Superior Court before Judge Beecher Gray. She entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder in the death of Tommy Welch, armed robbery, and accessory after the fact in the death of Joshua Wetzler. A third woman, Crystal Matlock, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to accessory after the fact for helping Barry Wetzler. Judge Gray imposed 3 consecutive sentences totaling 30 years and 8 months to 39 years and 2 months. Welch's family wept in the courtroom gallery. The house at 2749 Nob Hill Drive was condemned by the county housing department and later demolished. The case became the subject of a Viceland documentary series titled The Devil You Know. At the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh, Amber Burch, 36, will not be eligible for release until approximately 2044. Pazuzu Algarad never faced a jury for the killings. The land where Joshua Wetzler and Tommy Welch lay buried for 5 years is empty ground now. How a household rumored throughout its neighborhood to perform satanic rituals continued to operate undisturbed for a decade has never been fully answered.